A dog refuses to leave his owner's grave. The truth will break your heart. As the sun sets in a peaceful cemetery, a lone dog waits impassively beside a headstone. He will not depart, no matter how many people attempt to remove him. But why? What is the secret of this devoted animal? Why does he refuse to leave his owner's side? This is the tragic tale of Max, the dog that remained by his owner's side till the end. Long extending shadows were created over the peaceful cemetery as the sun sank below the horizon, leaking pink and orange hues into the sky. The ancient oak trees' golden leaves were rustled by a gentle breeze that whispered through their branches like invisible spirits and conveyed the smell of damp earth. Time passed, with the solemn toll of church bells resonating in the distance, a sound that was both sacred and eerie. One stood out among the rows of tombstones, each bearing witness to a life that had passed away. It was striking not because of its size, its inscription, or even the flowers left by loved ones. Instead, it was the lone person sitting next to it. A dog, motionless and unwavering, his fur tossed about by the evening breeze. His dark, sorrow-filled eyes stared at the cold stone as though he were hoping, praying, that the guy buried beneath it would somehow come up and call his name. Since the day Thomas was laid to rest, Max had remained by his owner's grave. He had accompanied the funeral procession, his strides heavy but purposeful, as if he knew that this would be his and Thomas's final trip together. Max had remained as the coffin was lowered, when the mourners said their last farewell in whispers and departed, their hearts heavy with sorrow. He huddled next to the recently tilled ground, his body a tiny, sobbing shadow in the last of the light. People showed up. Sitting there, steadfast in his devotion, they saw him. A generous, elderly woman, whose heart ached at the sight, brought him some food and placed a bowl of hot broth close by. Max did not eat, although he did sniff it. Beside him, a kind guy knelt down and spoke softly, luring him in with promises of safety, warmth, and a home. Max remained still. Even the graveyard caretaker attempted to pull him into his arms and carry him away. But she was used to loss, but never to such unwavering loyalty. However, Max fought, squirming away, his paws sinking into the soggy ground, as though he were securing himself to the one remaining rational aspect of the world. He refused to go. He was unable to go. Days gave way to nights, the sky turning from golden to pitch black and dotted with uncaring stars. He felt cold to the core as the rain soaked his fur. His shaking body was bitten by the howling cold winds. Autumn painted the trees gold and scarlet. Winter, merciless and relentless, buried the land under a thick coating of snow, and spring brought blossoms that waved in the breeze. Summer also brought the distant laughter of children playing beyond the cemetery gates. Max, however, stayed. Through storms and sour nights, he lay there, his body deteriorating and his once glossy coat becoming faded by the weather. His loyalty, however, remained unwavering. The silent, painful hope in his eyes never faded. People in the graveyard whispered to each other, their eyes fixed on the dog that would not go. Some said he was watching over his master even in death, protecting Thomas's spirit. Some said that he was waiting for the impossibility, for Thomas to come back, for the day when he might run into his arms again. Nobody really understood how deeply Max loved, how much he was grieving, or the unspoken vow he had made to the guy who had provided him with a lifetime of love and friendship. However, his tale would not be forgotten for long, because this kind of love and devotion was something uncommon and remarkable. And hearts would break, tears would fall, and maybe, just maybe, people would realize that there is a type of love that even death cannot destroy when the world hears Max's story. There was nothing that time or distance could quantify about Max and Thomas's friendship. It was a relationship based on unspoken understanding that was developed over years of friendship and cultivated in the quiet times that are frequently forgotten. Max was more than simply a dog. He was Thomas's shadow, his dependable friend, his most devoted partner, and the one unwavering presence in the world. Through a complex dance of reciprocity, glances, and subtle body language, they silently committed to supporting one another through thick and thin. Thomas knew their relationship was unique from the time Max was a young puppy, hardly able to open his eyes, his golden brown fur silky on his small frame. He had chosen Max from a litter of puppies, drawn to the small animal whose wildly waving tail appeared to be a physical manifestation of the happiness he was experiencing on the inside. It seemed as though Max already knew that he and Thomas were meant to be together, and that they were both a part of something greater than any of them could fully understand. Their relationship grew as Max did. Max would always nudge Thomas up in the morning. His icy nose would gently but adamantly press against the elderly man's grizzled palm, a silent plea to start the day's activities. Even though Thomas was old and his heart was weary, there was something about the way Max would look up at him, eyes full of affection, unasked questions, and genuine loyalty, that always made Thomas smile. Their daily routine was straightforward, but profound. With the fresh aroma of nature in the air and the dewy grass beneath their feet, Thomas and Max would take long walks in the park every morning. Max's youthful zeal seemed unabated as he chased after the fluttering leaves and the occasional bird. On occasion, they would sit side by side on a wooden bench beside the lake, where the serene water glistened in the soft sunlight. Thomas would speak to Max as if he were a real person, telling him about his early years, unmet love, and unrealized goals. Max would listen to him with open ears and eyes, as if he really understood what he said. The old guy would choose his favorite recliner by the fireplace in the evenings, when everything was quiet and the air was cool, the warmth of the wood crackling softly. Now, slower and older, Max would cuddle up at his feet and sigh happily, as though he too felt the burden of the day lift. Sometimes, while his fingers were absently caressing Max's fur, Thomas would murmur a long-forgotten song beneath his breath. At other times, the two would go outside and enjoy the refreshing night air while admiring the boundless sky. Even while the stars above them served as a constant reminder of their insignificance in the greater scheme of things, they didn't require any additional reminders during those peaceful times. Words weren't necessary for them. At least when it came to the big things, they didn't need to speak. Max was able to perceive Thomas's feelings, including his joy, loneliness, and quiet times for introspection. When Thomas felt depressed, he would nuzzle his hand. When the world seemed too heavy, he would poke him with his nose. Thomas reciprocated by understanding Max's every wag, look, and gentle nuzzle. He was able to read Max's eyes like a book, determining when his friend was content, worn out, or just in need of company. Words could never adequately describe the depth, purity, and steadfast nature of their love. Neither time nor situation could sever that friendship. However, fate had its own plans, just like everything else in life. And before long, their tranquil days would end, and their tale would take a surprising turn, one for which neither of them was ready. There would come a time when a loss that would rock the foundation of their world would disrupt the rhythms of their shared lives, a sadness too profound to avoid. Neither Thomas nor Max would be able to avoid the agony of that day, but it would demonstrate how strong their relationship was and how far it might go, even beyond death's grasp. The tiny, peaceful living room was filled with lovely, golden tones that danced as the early light softly crept through the drapes. There was too much quiet in the air. Thomas should normally have been out of bed by now, stretching his sore limbs in celebration of the day. Max would hear the promise of another day together in his deep, familiar voice. However, there was no movement today. No happy morning routine, no reassuring noises of awakening, nothing but quiet. Constantly aware of his owner's routine, Max lay curled up at the foot of the bed, his eyes alert, anticipating Thomas's customary awakenings. His head resting on his paws, he lay motionless, waiting for the familiar rustle of Thomas settling in bed or the soothing sound of a voice. He initially believed Thomas was just taking a bit more time to rest than normal, maybe enjoying a peaceful moment. However, as the minutes stretched into hours, Max began to feel apprehensive. He twitched uncomfortably, his tail which generally wagged with excitement at the prospect of a new day. He let out a little whimper. His heart was starting to rush as he slowly and carefully got to his feet. His paws were silent on the wooden floor as he padded to the bed. Max pressed his cold, damp nose on Thomas's fingers, anticipating the customary pat or comforting rub. However, nothing arrived today. No soft voice, no warmth. Max's perplexity turned into something more sinister, something he was unable to fully comprehend. His voice cracked with a mix of hope and dread as he barked once, then twice, louder this time. Confusion widened his eyes as he glanced up at Thomas. Still, no answer was received. The strained hush made the room seem to hold its breath. Max felt panic start to gnaw at his chest. He had a gut feeling that something was off, something that had never happened to him. In an attempt to rouse Thomas, his tongue licked his face while his claws furiously scratched at his immobile arm. As though to remind himself that he was still there, and that the tie they shared was real. His tail beat softly against the ground. Max's heart ached because Thomas stayed motionless and obstinate. Max could never comprehend the emptiness that had replaced the cozy warmth that had always enveloped them. There was a knock on the door, and then another, more determined. Thomas was called for by a timid, anxious voice on the other end. The tranquil, serene house was suddenly filled with urgency when the neighbor, suspecting that something was amiss, pushed the door open when no one answered. With frenzied footsteps resonating against the floors and words rising in low tones, the door flung wide. As strangers crowded the room, Max stood with his hair bristling with protectiveness and bewilderment, letting out a low growl. Unable to let anyone take him, unable to let them bother the man he had vowed to defend, he stood between them and his beloved Thomas. However, Max's body became motionless as the paramedics moved quickly, their faces solemn. As they toiled, he observed an increasing terror as their hands moved swiftly and effectively, but with an unfathomable misery in their eyes. The awful reality that Thomas wasn't waking up started to pound heavily on his chest. He would not return. The early air was filled with the harsh, melancholy scream of the ambulance siren, which broke the delicate silence. Max made a valiant attempt to follow Thomas one final time, his paws slipping against the wooden floor. As he attempted to go after the stretcher, his heart raced, and his veins were flooded with adrenaline. But he was restrained by a solid, kind, yet demanding hand. His sobs filled the empty room as he begged his pal to come back. However, the outside world changed, and the weight of a reality Max could not understand broke his heart. Once brimming with warmth, the house now felt painfully cold. The sound of Thomas's voice, the gentle buzz of music, and the laughter had all vanished, engulfed by the silence that now characterized the room. Max, the dependable friend, was abandoned. He had no one to follow or defend for the first time in his life. The loss hung over his heart like a perpetual shadow, and he was the only one in the world. Max had lost his world, his confidant, and his best buddy. And he became aware of how empty the world had become without Thomas by his side in that silent, calm chamber, where all that was left were the echoes of a life that had been lived. It was a low-key funeral. As the distant church bells tolled, marking the loss of another life, the dark sky overhead appeared to mirror the solemn atmosphere. In a sea of black, the mourners assembled, their hearts heavy with loss, and their faces marked with pain. Covered in plain white fabric, Thomas's casket was gently lowered into the ground. As though the universe itself were holding its breath, the only sound in the air was the gentle thump of dirt on wood. Standing in sad silence, the mourners were engrossed in their memories of the guy they had known, the man who had brought warmth, humor, and kindness into their lives. Nevertheless, one figure in this somber picture could not, would not, let go. Not quite yet. Max, the devoted canine companion who had accompanied Thomas through everything, remained still at the grave. His coat, which had been so shiny and vibrant, was now wet from the rain that had begun to fall and had mixed with the tears that seemed to flow from his heart incessantly. His big brown eyes, which were typically filled with happiness, curiosity, and boundless vitality, were suddenly obscured by a profound sadness that no one could ease. His tail, which used to be active and would wag in response to even the slightest cue from Thomas, was now limp at his side. He appeared to have lost all of his vitality, as if his master's death had robbed him of the capacity to experience anything other than heartbreak. Max was still there when the service ended, and the last of the mourners had turned to go. He never took his eyes off the recently buried grave. He saw the crowd, which was made up of people who had known Thomas in different ways than the dog, fade away, their footsteps vanishing from view. Not Max, though. He remained still. With his paws firmly placed on the earth, he gazed at the spot where Thomas had been laid to rest in a daze. His steadfast and profound loyalty held him in place. Despite their lack of understanding, some of the mourners attempted to persuade him to go. In the hopes that the smell of something familiar might motivate him to act, a good-hearted woman handed him lunch. In an attempt to ease him out of his duty, a kind man called out to him softly. Max, though, remained silent. He didn't raise his head. The urge to stay filled every fiber of his existence. He was waiting for Thomas, his best friend, his buddy, and his protector, rather than merely for time to pass and for the world to continue moving. Without him, he was unable to depart. Weeks passed, and Max's universe expanded to include the cemetery. Suddenly, the town's once bustling activity appeared so far away. The coldness of winter was carried by the icy winds that howled through the trees. Max remained motionless, despite his fur being matted and twisted from the intense rain. He lay beside the grave night after night, braving the bitter cold, the icy wind, and the constant rain, all out of devotion to the one person who had meant the world to him. Max didn't care that his once vibrant coat had faded to a ghost of its former glory. Even though his heart was broken, he persisted in believing in the one person who had always supported him. Every now and then a bystander would pause and gaze in silent admiration at the dog who refused to leave his station. Some would say nice things to him, while others would just stand by and stare, not knowing how to react to this broken animal. However, they all agreed that Max wasn't merely waiting for things to change. He wasn't only waiting around, counting down the days until he could resume his normal life. No, Max was anticipating Thomas's arrival. He was looking forward to seeing the man who had been his constant friend and who had brought love, laughter, and company into his life. And Max refused to go until Thomas came back. The cemetery had turned, become a place of grief, not only for Thomas's passing, but also for the dog's unresolved grief. It served as a silent, agonizing reminder of the depths of devotion and love, a love so pure that not even death could break the tie. Despite being silent and invisible to many, Max's vigil served as evidence of the power of that link, which would endure no matter how much time went by. The faint flutter of the leaves and the gentle whispers of the wind made it abundantly evident to everyone who heard it. Max and Thomas's love was unique, timeless, and far from over. Many of the residents of the little village couldn't stand to watch the devoted dog suffer in solitude after hearing about Max's vigil. As soon as word got out about the distraught dog, a constant flow of people from the community started coming to the cemetery in the hopes of giving Max some solace, if only temporarily, to calm his soul. Each of them brought something unique, but equally significant with them: food. They were farmers, store owners, educators, and kids. While some filled bowls with cool, fresh water, others brought remnants from their kitchens. Some, particularly the kids, brought sweets in the hopes of luring Max out of the hereafter with something familiar and delicious. Initially, Max would take the meal, his hunger temporarily surpassing the intensity of his grief. For a little while, the people would witness the dog's eyes soften as he ate the food that was handed to him, seemingly temporarily touched by strangers' generosity. However, Thomas remained constantly on his mind, even while he ate the food. Even though he was hungry, his gaze would never leave the place where Thomas was buried. Max would get to his feet as soon as the last bite was gone. Despite eating a healthy diet, his physique remained rigid and exhausted, as if the burden of his sorrow was too much for him to handle. He'd turn and trot back to the cemetery slowly. Every step seemed to bear the weight of his anguish, and his tail, which had formerly wagged so excitedly, now hung limply between his thighs. When they noticed Max's affinity to the grave, some of the villagers made an effort to find him a new home. In an attempt to ease his suffering, they spoke to him softly. In an attempt to gain his trust and return him to the comforts of a home that could mend his shattered heart, some even attempted to guide him away. More desperate people attempted to support him by giving him tender words and warm embraces in the hopes that Max would eventually be able to move on, and that, with the solace of a new family, Thomas's memories may start to fade. Max, however, was unmoved. No consolation they could provide could compare to the closeness he had with Thomas. Max always found his way back to the cemetery, regardless of how many times they attempted to move him or how many tender hands attempted to guide him away. With the quick accuracy of a creature that knew exactly where he wanted to be, he would slip out of their grasp and dart through their arms. He would run resolutely back to the grave, his place of loss, his place of devotion, his eyes full of the same sorrow that had held him there for weeks. As they observed this unwavering dedication, the populace started to comprehend. They now realized that Max was clinging to something priceless that no one could take away from him. Rather than merely lamenting the passing of his master, it seemed as if Max's spirit understood that his journey was unfinished and that he would have nowhere to go or a place to call home if Thomas weren't there. Even while his body was at the graveyard, exhausted and worn out, his heart was still with Thomas, under the ground where he had been buried. As Max's vigil went on, The locals, many of whom had also lost loved ones, could only stare in wonder and grief. They witnessed the intensity of his devotion, the innocence of his sorrow, and the intense love that even death's icy grip could not shatter. He held to more than simply the grave. It was his vow to Thomas, a vow that could never be broken. Consequently, the residents of the town departed, each bearing their sorrows and unable to do more than honor the dog's relationship with his master. Max's narrative was not one of straightforward loss. Rather, it was one of love, commitment, and a connection that was unbreakable even by death. And Max stayed by Thomas's side, silent, steady, and unflinching as the days stretched into weeks and the seasons changed again. His intense and unwavering grief served as a reminder to everyone who came by that true love never wavers or fades. It just perseveres, no matter the price. It was a typical day, with the sadness of the previous weeks permeating the atmosphere. The silence was broken by the sound of gravel crunching beneath slow, deliberate footsteps. Max's eyes were darkened and dulled by a pain that had not gone away since the day Thomas was buried, and his weary, aged head slowly rose. His once bright and enthusiastic eyes had turned to a silent sadness that appeared to weigh him down just as much as the chilly cemetery air. However, there was something unique about this guest. This was neither a stranger nor one of the nice villagers who had repeatedly made an effort to entice him to go. No, there was more to this man, a silent, tangible presence that seemed to bear Max's suffering as well. The man moved slowly toward the grave, his feet deliberate and delicate, as though he wasn't sure how to face the scene in front of him. He stopped at the base of the tomb, his gaze following the plain gravestone with Thomas's name on it, and then, almost without thinking, he looked at Max. The dog remained still, his body exhausted and haggard after days of unrelenting sorrow. Max refused to leave, even though the constant rain had left his once glossy fur matted and wet. When he saw the dog's spirit, the lively life that had once existed, now muted and covered with grief that seemed to go as deep as the soil itself, the man's heart constricted. The man crouched down next to Max without saying anything, his hands quivering just a little as he reached out to caress the dog's fur. At first, Max recoiled, reflexively avoiding the strange touch, but then something in the man's voice seemed to cut through the haze of Max's sorrow. A voice so familiar, so reassuring, that it seemed like a summons from a far-off but treasured memory. As if afraid to shatter the silence, the guy murmured slowly, his words barely audible over the wind's rustle. "Max, he loved you more than anything." Something deep inside Max changed in that moment. His hazy eyes, which had seemed vacant and far away, softened, and his ears pricked up. His eyes sparkled with a sense of familiarity, consolation, and something more profound and valuable. The reverberation of those words seemed to pierce Max's very existence, bringing back memories of the warmth of Thomas's presence and their shared friendship. For a brief instant, the oppressive anguish relaxed its grip. Max gave a quiet, nearly inaudible whimper, a sound that was weighed down by years of steadfast devotion and love that had never demanded anything in return. He seemed to be letting go of all he had been holding on to since that tragic day with just one sound. Max let out one last sigh of satisfaction and laid his head to the ground again. As though it had always been there, by Thomas's side, he snuggled up next to the grave, his weary body seeking solace from his master. The burden that had been so heavy on him started to lessen as his breathing slowed. Every muscle in Max's body relaxed in a state of tranquil surrender. Max's eyes closed one more time as the sun started to set, bathing the cemetery in a gentle golden glow, while the breeze carried the aroma of wildflowers and earth. After bearing the pain of loss for so long, his spirit at last achieved the serenity it had been seeking. Max, the faithful friend, the unwavering comrade, was sleeping. His voyage had concluded, but not in despair, but with the peaceful knowledge that he had kept his word to Thomas, a vow that nothing, not even death, could revoke. It seemed as though the earth itself was whispering a final goodbye to the dog, whose love had never faltered, a love so pure that not even death could break it. As the sky grew darker and the stars started to sparkle above, Max passed away quietly, as though he had been waiting for that last chance to be with Thomas, not in this life, but in the next. Once a place of sorrow, the cemetery now seemed to breathe a peaceful sigh. The winds that had previously borne the wailing cries of a dog in grief were now softly murmuring through the woods, as though the ground itself were lulling the faithful friend who had at last found peace. The memory of two souls forever entwined, one man, one dog, connected by a link stronger than any force of nature, transcending time and space, now remained in the grave where Thomas lay, and the location where Max had faithfully stood guard. After witnessing Max's constant vigil, the villagers experienced a significant internal transformation. Slowly, understanding began to fill their hearts, which had been heavy with grief for the dog who had never left his master's side. Although they had witnessed other dogs come and go, none had ever shown the same level of dedication and loyalty as Max. His refusal to go, and his vigil, which endured through the coldest nights and the worst storms, became a tale of love that would be passed down through the town's generations, a monument to the strength of love, commitment, and the unbreakable relationship that can exist between an animal and a human. Max's story was no longer simply about a dog waiting by a grave, but also about amazing loyalty. There was much more to Max and Thomas's story than just a dog and his owner. It became a living reminder of the kind of love that endures beyond time, space, and even death, a symbol of the unbreakable bond that may develop between two souls. Their relationship was a unique gem in a world full of ephemeral relationships. It lasted forever, unwavering, as though to demonstrate that love, when it is genuinely unconditional, is unbreakable. It was a love that had no limits, no restrictions, and no end date. It transcended the boundaries of the material world and was love in its purest form, unadulterated by time. The grave was unaltered by the changing of the seasons. The flowers left by guests, some of whom Max had never met before, were more colorful every year, each one honoring the relationship between a dog and its owner. Once a place of grief, the cemetery had transformed into a peaceful haven, where the memory of a loyal dog and his adoring owner persisted, woven into the town's very fabric. Max's love for Thomas, which had been so pure and unflinching, would endure even after he closed his eyes for the last time. Those who had seen the extraordinary devotion of a dog that would not let go would always carry it in their hearts. As a result, Max's narrative endured as a timeless reminder to everyone who heard it. Certain relationships are so strong and unadulterated that death cannot sever them. An unbreakable thread of love between them woven a legacy of commitment, devotion, and the uncommon, exquisite love that only a bond like theirs could provide. If this story touched your heart, consider sharing it with someone who believes in the power of love and loyalty. And don't forget to subscribe for more heartwarming stories like this one.